Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicholas DeMoncho. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you, all of you here tonight, for a lecture in the Monday night A+D series and in the BCNM Art, Technology, and Culture lecture series, founded more than 20 years ago by my colleague Ken Goldberg, who will be on the stage in a matter of moments to formally introduce his and our friend Nicholas Negroponte speaking tonight. I will take the liberty, though, of beginning with both an acknowledgement of two people, both of whom have shaped my life in various ways. One, of course, is my father, John DeMoncho, joining us here in the audience tonight, to my great delight. My father had a long and distinguished career as a city planner before being recruited from Australia, where I grew up originally, to Boston to become Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT. Under his tenure, the Media Lab was founded by Nicholas Negroponte and Jerome Wiesner. I was not aware of this at the time. I was in middle school, but what I was very much aware of, I guess is a way in which I've always felt a great and very personal appreciation of the subsequent work Nick has done to bring the promise of computing and its connectivity to every child on Earth. Because I stand before you tonight in some small way as the very first one laptop per child, because Nick's slow marketing of the power of computing on my father and our household took the very specific physical form of a series of computing devices delivered to our doorstep in Brookline, which no other members of our household seemed to have great interest in, but with which I was immediately entranced. And of course also by the surrounding culture of the Media Lab and the garden and all the rest. So in a very small, but as you can see, influential way, I'm very much in Nicholas's debt, as I am also, of course, in my father's debt deeply as well. So it's my great pleasure to see them both here together again tonight and to welcome Nick, and I turn it over to Ken to give a far more serious and appropriate introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. I want to also just take a moment to thank Nicholas and Lara and the entire Berkeley Center for New Media crew for putting on this series and keeping it running. So thank you all for that. And I know that Nick loves long introductions, as you mentioned earlier. And I will say that he's almost a quintessential speaker for this series, having made major contributions to art, technology, and culture. He was born in the United States, in New York City, but has very deep roots connecting him with Greece. And he attended various boarding schools before he went to MIT, where he studied architecture. He then did his master's and went on to teach at various illustrious universities, including Yale, Michigan, and Berkeley. He then went back to MIT and formed in 1967 the Architecture Machine Group in the School of Architecture. And there he did a variety of interesting projects, one of which I love called Seek, which I hope he'll mention tonight, but it was really an art project involving mice and technology and perception in a very, very deep way. He then, from there, and also around this time, he came up with this idea of what he called what was later called actually the Negroponte switch, and that was a prediction that, and this was made in the early '80s, that there would be that TVs would, rather than just taking their information from the air, would suddenly become increasingly connected to cables. So essentially predicted cable television, and then he simultaneously predicted the switch that telephones, which were always connected by cables, would start working through the air, which we all know has pretty much happened completely. So that was in the late 70s and the 80s or so, and then in 1985, as Nicholas just as the other Nicholas just noted, he formed in a huge leap of visionary creativity the Media Lab at MIT. And it has gone on to do amazing things, and I hope he'll be telling us some things about these. But in 1992, he teamed up with Jane and Lewis, who are right here in the front row, and formed and was played a key role in the origins of Wired magazine, which is again way ahead of its time, echoing again this Negroponte switch idea of wires playing different roles and being wired and unwired. And he wrote a column for that later turned into the book, the classic Being Digital, which was published in 1995. And he made a number of predictions. One was that there would be, that people would spend more time on now remember, this is 1995, the internet was brand new. He said that people would eventually spend more time on the internet than they would on television. And then he also noted that there would be customized newspapers, that we would no longer just read the big newspaper, but we would get customized newspapers. And this was going to be absolutely wonderful and terrific, and we would all get our custom information, and there was, what could possibly go wrong with that? But it seems to have been, again, he was prescient in his doing this. And he has gone on to then, thinking through the impact of technology and media in a very deep way, he understood the role of education and how it was necessary to bring computing to vast numbers of students around the world. And so he came up with the idea of coming up with a very affordable computer, what was called the one laptop per child. And he then, by a force of personality, basically got this to happen, brought in great designers from all over the world to build it, and then started distributing these in countries from Africa to South America. And it has essentially been viewed as essentially a precursor to the modern laptop or tablet that we all have. So it was, again, he was way ahead of his time throughout all of these things. So I want to say that, if anyone watched the football game yesterday, things don't always turn out the way you think they will. But I think we're going to hear some new predictions tonight. I hope we will. And I'm very excited to hear what he's going to do and say. And so please give a warm welcome back to Nick Negroponte.
Turn this on. Do I have a clicker here? Just dawned on me. There are some. Is there, wherever it comes. I've decided what I will do tonight is sort of be a little bit personal, because what the hell, I mean, it can take some risks, and I don't have anything to lose. It's a very interesting position to be in life, and that is to not have a responsibility. I'm not the director of the Media Lab. I don't represent anybody anymore. I don't have to worry about a career. I don't have to worry about an income. So it gives you a level of independence which is relatively rare. I find myself in meetings at the United Nations and in other places, and you realize there's nobody else around the table like you because everybody has a vested interest or everybody's representing somebody. So it's kind of a new and liberating feeling, and I'm going to walk you. Oops, what? Oh, you have to set it up. Okay. And so what I'm going to try and share is sort of where these sort of ideas came from and sort of how they evolved. And they came from, to be honest, a position of privilege. I grew up in a very privileged family. Everybody in my family had been to college, and their parents and grandparents, and everybody was pretty wealthy. And they weren't immigrants, they were visitors. They came to the United States for the war to do this and do that, and went back to Europe. And so I just never knew life except something that was pretty comfortable. And I went to various boarding schools and prep schools, and always won the art prizes. And I just loved, as a child, and did rather well. But then I made, sort of call it a mistake, in high school, and that was I did very well in math. I got an 800 in whatever they were called, the SATs. And so I went to my headmaster at the time, and I said, look, I do well in art, and I do well in math, so clearly I should study architecture. And he looked at me, went right over my head. He said, I like gray suits, and I like pinstripe suits, but I hate gray pinstripe suits. And I thought, wow, okay. I studied architecture. I went to architecture school. Anyway, and I did it at MIT, which was really a stroke of luck. First of all, it was a very good department of architecture, one of the best. And my time there was terrific, but because I was at MIT, I was surrounded by computers and even went back and did a graduate degree, which was unheard of at the time, also in architecture, and realized that the gray pinstripe suit, or at least the mixture of the two, was computers. It wasn't architecture, it was computers. And made a personal decision at the time, maybe I just wasn't a good enough potential architect, or from my studies thought that maybe I wouldn't be a great architect. But I thought if you make the tools, you could have a much bigger influence. And if your interest was to have an influence, then if you made the tools that lots of other people used, you may not get credit for it, but you could have an influence. So I set out to do a career of that. And people like Donald Linden, who's here tonight, became the head of the department. You gave me a little grief over time, but it sort of pushed my career forward. And then John DiMancio, who's here, helped launch the Media Lab, in fact, named it. The name Media Lab came from John DiMancio. So it was a very convenient place to be and to make the tools. Then after doing that for whatever, 15, 20 years, I said, okay, go one step further back. Don't just make the tools for other people to use, but if you will, make the tools for the people to make the tools, or at least make the place where others can make the tools. And that's when we started the Media Lab. And when I started, depending how you count, we were 2 or 3 faculty. I'll talk about some of them. But today it's 800 people. And what is the common characteristic of those 800 people is that they are all misfits. They are truly academic and very often social misfits. So I'm going to talk to you about what I'm interested in, but it comes from that context. And let me skip over some slides. Oh yeah, I wanted to, by way of background, and now that the slides are back, my memory's back. I'm going to remember what I had planned to say. And these are sort of just 5 comments that really set the stage for what I'm going to, sort of the point of view. Some of the things I'm going to suggest this evening, I don't want to call them radical, but they're going to sound very absurd. They're going to, when you leave, you're going to say, no, did he really say that? Well, one of them comes from this axiom. I really wake up in the morning and ask myself, will normal market forces do what I'm doing today? And if the answer is yes, don't do it, because market forces will do it. So MIT's responsibility, the Media Lab's responsibility, my responsibility is to do what market forces don't do, and then, presumably they'll become part of society or the market. So that's one thing. And then the other is, it took me a long time to understand the difference between a mission and a market, only because so many other people confuse it. Not everything is a market. And I saw this with 1 laptop per child. My 2 biggest, I don't want to call them competitors, but the people who violently opposed it were Intel and Microsoft. And the reason is it was their market. And they didn't see it as a mission at all. It was not a mission for them, and it hasn't been and won't be. And then this is another one which is very hard to persuade people. How often do you hear somebody saying, I'm doing evidence-based funding, or I'm doing measurement-based philanthropy? Measurement? If you have to measure it, it wasn't worth doing. You should only do things the result of which are so big that the best measure is self-evidence. Now try saying that to a group of people. Self-evident. Don't measure. If you're measuring, you're wasting your time. And And they sit there and they say, well, that's what we do. That's all we do. We measure. Our directors want us to measure. Our philanthropists want us to measure. And the answer is because you're doing small things. And it's a little harder. Capitalism is not democracy is again, this is not something that you need to even mention in Europe, but here it's true, it's conflated. If you say this in Washington, you're considered, it's anti-American or something, there's something wrong. And I don't talking about this ridiculous administration, I'm just talking about it just in general, that it's a very deep different. And then the last one is sort of about life. And I think we were all brought up, anybody sort of older than, let's say, 40, in a world where everything was a fried egg. There was a yolk and there was a white, and there was a crisp line between them. And it was for so many things. So this was work and this was play, or you were in this or you're not in that. And so many things have become omelets. And so many things are so much more intermixed that life is really much more of an omelet than a fried egg. Just look at your iPhone. Just look at the messages that come through, the intermixture. It's a kid, it's a spouse, it's a business, it's life. The sort of omelet theory of life is a pretty real one. So with those as background, there are three people I want to sort of recognize, at least as influences in my life, the highest of which was certainly Marvin Minsky. Now, Marvin was one of the 5 people who in 1958 founded the field of AI, and they called it artificial intelligence at that meeting in Dartmouth that summer. And Marvin was a neighbor. We were social friends. He brought his kids in little baskets. If people know Margaret Minsky, the first time she came to my house for dinner, she was carried in a basket. And as a friend, got to realize through Marvin Minsky, who died a couple of years ago, that only hard problems are interesting. That hard and intractable problems were the ones that fascinated him. And also that you could look at everything sort of from a meta point of view. You could pop up a level and ask questions which weren't right down at the level of the specific question itself. And then his partner, his writing partner and intellectual partner, Seymour Papert, was also a very important figure to the early days of the Media Lab. Both of Marvin and Seymour were founding faculty of the Media Lab because they were, to some degree, rejected from their respective departments. So it was already a misfits organization, the Salon des Refusés, in a real sense. Seymour was the kind of person who would say, you can't think about thinking unless you think about thinking about something. That was a very Seymour Papert type. And you think about that for a while and you realize that, yes, well, maybe you can learn about learning, but can you learn about learning without learning about something? And the chances are you can. But what does that mean? And then the last person was Jerry Wiesner himself. And I have a suggestion for anybody who wants to start a lab in an academic institution. The key to success is to get the president to be your partner. And Jerry Wiesner was president of MIT at the time, and it was a little bit like driving down an interstate highway and a state trooper stops you for speeding and then looks into the window and sees that in the passenger seat you have a gorilla. And they say, please keep speeding. And Jerry was the person behind whom we all stood, and he protected us, and we did many stupid things. And very often now I find myself trying to do for others at the Media Lab what Jerry did for me, which is sometimes just protecting you from your own stupidity because you're also doing lots of other things that are probably pretty interesting. So I put this slide in because so many times in my life I have said, starting at very early ages, and Ken sort of started to name some of them, that such and such would happen in 10 years. But what happens is that 10 years arrive and you get to look back and sort of say, you know, did it happen or it didn't? And then you say something else will happen, and then you don't do it every 10 years, you do it interspersed, and you can look at these. And finally, you've done so many loops, if you will, you sort of feel you've been to the future. Not because you really have, but you've been around so long and you've said so many times, and that does or it doesn't happen, and it usually does happen because they're not that, you know, complicated to predict. And what do they have in common? And one of the things they have in common is that at the time, people dismiss it as pretty stupid. I'll give you a very specific example. We felt, I don't think I have a slide to show it, we felt in the early days, and this goes back to the sort of early 70s, that people would interact with displays by touching them. And we built a lot of the first touch-sensitive displays. People thought that was so stupid. They wrote peer-reviewed, quote unquote, articles about how bad it was, and one of them was very rigorous and said there are 3 things wrong with touching a display. The first is that when you touch the display, your hand is going to occlude what you're trying to touch, and that hence it's much better to move a mouse down here and have a cursor moving on the screen. The second thing is that fingers are very low resolution, and so it's like writing a postcard with a cigar. That was my metaphor, not theirs, but it would be sort of not good enough resolution. And the third, which was the most laughable, is that you'd get the screen dirty. And these things, and Steve Jobs, whom I knew very well at that time and was showing him a lot of this stuff, quoted some of those things, whatever it was, 10 years later, when he came out with the iPhone, which was a brilliant product. And today, everybody, and some of you probably even at this instant, are using your fingers on a screen because it's a very natural way to do it. And the fingers actually have pretty high resolution, and you learn how to do it, et cetera. So many of the things, and maybe this is an excuse to say some of them tonight. This slide and the next one are, again, by way of introduction. This is a computer program, excuse the out of focus display, but it shows a departure point and a destination point where you could call an automobile and it would come and pick you up at that coordinate and drop you off at the destination. It happens that I had actually worked on this program and written computer programs for it, and it was in 1965. It was called CARS, which stood for Computer Aided Routing System, and was done on a display that was pretty early for its time at MIT. And so you say, well, wait a second, that happened in 65. Why did it take, 50 plus years for Uber to happen, or whatever, a little bit? What was the explanation for all the time in between? And the explanation of the time in between is that you needed all these constituent parts. For instance, GPS wasn't launched and didn't exist until 1976. So until 1976, nothing knew where it was, effectively, at least the way we do today. You needed a mapping system. Those didn't come out until, the early ones were pretty inaccurate too. You need a handheld thing. You need a ability-to-text thing. So you look at this, which is old and maybe sort of some basic piece of it, but it took all these other moons, if you will, to kind of line up to suddenly get an Uber or a Lyft or something to drop out the other end. It's not that somebody was suddenly a genius and they had been stupid before that. It's just that all these things lined up. So the question is, what's lining up now? What are the things that are coming that something could drop out of? And I'll tell you at least what I think some of them are. This is another one. I only show it because I remember wearing it. It's an old, 3D virtual reality machine. I believe it's 67. And you can see there are physical connections so that when you move your head, sort of do the things. So again, that's more explainable in the sense that there are not too many moons there, but they still had to make the kind of progression that requires today. So what is, in the world of connectivity, which I'm taking in the pretty broad sense, what is happening now, or what is happening or could happen, is first of all, if you look at telecommunications in general, and you look back, 50 years if you want, it really was thought of like tobacco and alcohol. It really was a luxury. If you look at African countries, and all of which had state-owned telephone companies, and those state-owned telephone companies were, in some cases, the largest source of hard currency that country had. And the way you did that is you screwed people who were making long-distance phone calls to subsidize, or at least to have some local calls. And this was very self-evident if you would go to any African nation and you make a phone call from Rwanda to Uganda, which is like calling from Rhode Island to Connecticut, you would be paying $50 a minute for a very bad connection that might take you an hour to even establish in the first place. So where you got the worst service, you paid the most, and it was, again, the attitude was that this was a luxury. This was not part of society. It was not something that would help lift society and bring it forward. And there was this extraordinary coincidence. It's, again, like the moons lining up, and that is that the emergence of wireless phones, the emergence of cell phones, happened exactly at the same time when countries decided they would privatize some of these utilities or some of these services. And you look at Europe, and almost to every single one of those countries privatized exactly when cell phones allowed them to give a license to somebody else who didn't have to dig up the streets to build a phone system. They could just put a few towers and establish a pretty reasonable network and, quote, compete with the incumbent wireline phone company. So again, it's historical, call it accident, but not too many people realize that is, again, you'll see why I think that's relatively important. And then something happened that was absolutely extraordinary. In the early 80s, the UK and Britain were the first to auction spectrum. Now, without going into a lecture of spectrum, it is fair to say that spectrum is basically we own it like we own the park. It's Central Park. You wouldn't sell the rights to Central Park. You actually make it part of, if you will, it's part of the social construct. And instead of selling it, maybe you should use it differently than countries that did sell it and found windfalls. The UK and Germany perhaps didn't need a windfall, but boy, when the African countries saw that, they decided, wow, this is the way to make a lot of money for our treasuries. And even let's pretend there was no corruption and all the money went into the treasury and was used for the national good. It was done at the expense of telecommunications itself being the national good. because suddenly the people you auctioned it to, and you always auctioned it to more than one because you thought competition was good, and you'll see I'll argue in a moment that competition is bad. The reason that you do that is then or at least one of the consequences is that every time you make a call, you're paying for that license. So it's not a great idea, and yet it is totally assumed. Every single person in the industry is doing it. Nobody speaks up against it. Nobody speaks out against it. It isn't done. And then the assumption, and boy is this an assumption, that the private sector is more efficient than the public sector. Well, that's a reasonable rule of thumb, but it doesn't have to be. Have you ridden on a Swiss train? There's no, yes, the private sector is going to have different motivations to be more efficient, but it need not always be that way. And so there's some examples of where, I ask myself, is it really, that much more efficient? And in this country, and I'm going to lose half the audience in a moment, and that is, what's the worst thing that has happened to public schools? The absolute single worst thing that has happened to public schools in the United States is private school, because it sucks out of the system money, people, parents who would otherwise, and you say, well, I'm not going to send my kid to public school, and why listen to him? He never went to public school. I didn't go to any public school. So it's complete hypocrisy, and yet it's still the truth, and we can't get away from the fact that when you believe something as part of civic society, it should be part of civic society. And if you look at the countries that have the best education measured by, let's say you believe in the PISA tests, you look at the countries and almost none of them have private education, the ones at the top of the list. It's kind of amazing that you did. Sweden, Finland, those countries that are always up at number 1 or 2. So there's some interesting issues, and one of the problems, I believe, is competition. Now, this is a little harder. I have really pretty fierce arguments with some very close friends. I think competition is sort of a disease that we have elevated, and we believe everything should be competitive. Well, you go to, again, I hate to use countries like Finland, but in Finland there are no tests, there's no sense of competition, no parent talks about how their kid's doing in school versus another kid. It's not part of society. That those kids brought up, kindergarten to 12th grade, to collaborate, not to compete. And so the fact that we assume that everything's competition, I was at a UN meeting recently, and the American ambassador to telecommunications, there is such a person, the American ambassador who represents telecommunications said at the meeting, well, the only thing I can tell you about the future is it'll be based on competition. And I'm saying, why on earth would you say that? Well, why would you do that? Why, because clearly, if you're going to compete, you're going to have, as we already do, people building multiple infrastructures and so on. You don't compete when you build a military, you don't compete. They subcontract and have competition, but the service itself, roads, sidewalks, other things, whether they're human rights or civil part of what civil society provides, it's not that we have competitive sidewalks, or even streets are very rarely paid for. So here's the goal, and this is what is, and I tend to do it through children only because it's the most precious natural resource. And that sounds like a sort of cute line, but I cannot tell you how many heads of state I've asked, sort of like a little game, what is your most precious natural resource? And they start thinking, depending what kind of, it's gold, or it's diamonds, or it's this, or it's that. They're saying, no, it's children, and ha, ha, ha. And then they think about it, and it gets people thinking, and it's certainly true. So in 1982, it was sort of couple of years before the Media Lab was built, Seymour Papert and I had a chance to work on trying to bring to Africa, in this case, to Senegal and several places in Africa, actually, and Pakistan as well, some early computers. Steve Jobs had given us lots of the apples, and we just shipped them into these countries. And these kids, like the kid in this picture, just played those keyboards like pianos. We thought, wow, maybe, these kids aren't in outside sort of suburbs of Boston. They are, in villages where they haven't, nothing. Obviously enough electricity to run the apple, but that's about it. And yet they were so comfortable using this stuff. Flash forward like 20 years. It took, in between, I spent my time building the Media Lab, but flash forward 20 years, I found myself in Cambodia, again, for personal reasons, built a school. My son connected it. You can see a satellite dish in the back. And the kids got the laptops, and I bought them. Actually, it was in the early days of eBay, so I was getting laptops that way and sending them to the village. And when these kids took those laptops home, because the little village had Wi-Fi in it, the parents loved them. They adored them, because when the kids opened them up, it was the brightest light source in the house. There was no light. So I thought, boy, for a metaphor and for something, really happening, what in that picture would not happen by normal market forces? Almost everything missing, like electricity and the telecommunications, the market would bring. But the market didn't seem to be lowering the costs of laptops, because Microsoft and Intel were having this little nuclear war where Microsoft would use more computing and Intel would make a faster processor and Microsoft would use more of it. We joked, haha, and it was made a funny line. But it just went on and on and on. And instead of following Moore's law, it just stayed at a steady $1,000, and the cost of a laptop was always $1,000. And interestingly, it got slower, because Microsoft always put a little bit more than Intel could catch up with, and just to open the machine and boot it up became interminable. But if you looked at it differently and you said, well, let's try and make something that is really low cost and make it as a nonprofit. This is a very important small point, because at this point in time, sort of the mid-2000s, early 2000s, I was no longer, or about to no longer be, the director of the Media Lab, and all of my friends said, start a company, make a lot of money, and give it away. So build the laptops, sell them, and give it away. And I cannot tell you, it was unanimous. And maybe it's just my nature that when something's that unanimous, you just gotta do the opposite. It's just, and I started a nonprofit, and everybody thought, well, nobody's going to work for a nonprofit because they can't have equity in it, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that the people who worked for the nonprofit were doing it for a different reason. And there was, I don't even have to call it a higher calling, but it was a different calling. It was a different reason that they were working. It's like the open source community. Why do people do open source? It's really good reasons, but it doesn't follow any normal economic model, and it certainly doesn't follow some of it. Also, you could team up with people, could have Kofi Annan as a partner, because you were a nonprofit, and that was very, very key. And Yves Behar, who's across the bridge, helped design, or did design it. I shouldn't say helped, he did it. And we built what we called affectionately the $100 laptop. It never got to 100. It got like to 140 was the closest we ever got. But its cost and its price were the same, because the group that had been organized to do it was paid for separately. And whenever you put some in the field, if it was even 1 million of them, you weren't trying to make any margin. So if the cost of materials went down, the price went down. And so it really fluctuated more on the price of oil than anything else. And what happened with one laptop per child, which I could show you many pictures, is something that almost nobody knows. And it's just not written about. We did 3 million laptops in about 2.5, 3 years, which if you were a startup and I told you I'm going to do 3 million laptops in 2+ years, you would be funding me really fast because that's pretty good. That's a pretty good number for a startup to get out in the field. But what was more important than the number is, I'm going to use Brazil as an example, but it happened in many occasions. I went to Lula and I said, look, let me write the tender because he was going to do 1 million laptops. I said, let me write the tender. And I will not only bid on it, but I will bid on it publicly. I'll publish in the newspaper what we're going to bid. So we wrote a tender, not one that favored us, but one that we thought was pretty good. Then we bid on it we said it was $182 in the newspaper. We said on the front page. And guess who won the tender? Doesn't matter who won it, but they won it for $181. And I said, wow, this is a really good scheme because I don't want to build laptops. I don't need to build laptops. If I build 1 million laptops, we don't make more money than if we build 5 laptops. Let's keep bidding. And let's keep worldwide, every tender that comes out, we are going to bid an honest price. And why do people believe the price? Because we had shipped 3 million. And why did they continue believing it? Because they knew we had a factory. We had a factory outside of Shanghai. We had the designers in Taipei. And we could push the button and make 100,000 a week on one assembly line by just pushing a button. And everybody knew that. And the power of that was to never push the button, was to always go and force everybody else. And it's hard to count, but we think it's somewhere between 45 and 50 million laptops. And those are the interesting laptops, not the 3 million we sold. And that was so counterintuitive because you really think, even as a nonprofit, that what you should be doing is selling more to make more, to do. And here, what you really need to do is have enough credibility to actually change the balance. And there's sort of a number of stories I can tell you, but to not get too far off, we then ran an experiment. And this experiment is based on a very simple position that I can't tell you how important it is, because very influential people like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, talk about the next 1.5 billion people. Well, you know, that's a piece of cake. The next 1.5 billion people can join the internet and be part of the digital society by just a little bit of fussing with pricing and so on and so forth. It's the last 1.5 billion people that are much, much more interesting. They're rural, they're illiterate, it's hard to get to them, and just all sorts of things. Most of them don't have power, and you go down, and it's so intractable. It's a Marvin Minsky type problem. So you say, that's the interesting problem. And even if you can't solve that completely, by working on it, maybe you can be doing things. So we did an experiment which isn't as rigorous as it should have been, but it was nonetheless interesting, where we brought tablets to a village. We brought as many tablets as there were children in 2 villages in Ethiopia, one in the north, one in the south. And the villagers had in common the characteristic that there was 0 literacy. No parent could read or write, no child. There was no writing in the village. There were no signs. There was no print. There was no newspaper. In fact, I remember saying at the time we were doing that there was no alphabet anywhere in the village. And of course, when you say something like that, somebody's determined to find some letters. And there were in the clothing label of a couple of kids had some text in it. So I was wrong. There was a little bit of text in the village. But the kids, we brought the tablets to the village, and we left them in closed boxes without instructions and without people. No instructions were brought. And the only thing that happened the day before or 2 days before is that somebody went into the village with a solar panel and showed one of the adults, basically you have to put it outdoors, not indoors, just to make sure it was getting sun that connected to a car battery. And what happened in this village, because the tablets were hot, even though there were no people, when you opened the tablet and you used it, it recorded what you were doing. And we were able to then go into the village periodically, like every 2 or 3 weeks, and grab the little SIM cards and put in new ones. And it took minutes for the kids to find the on-off switch itself. Pretty interesting concept if you haven't seen switches, let alone power. And perhaps the best slide of my entire life, I've never had in the media lab before a better slide than this. Not photographically, it's not a very good photograph, but the content of it is extraordinary. The kids not only turned on the tablets, within 5 days they were using 50 apps per day per child, 7 hours a day. Within 2 weeks they were singing ABC songs, and within 6 months they hacked Android, and they all speak English today, okay? So there were no teachers, and nobody had been to school. They didn't even know. I mean, why did they collect? Why did they all meet? And the kid on the right seems to have nominated himself as teacher, and the kid on the your far left is using that kid's tablet, who's using that kid's tablet, talk about this. We didn't see that in one laptop per child. One laptop per child, we went through schools, through ministers of education, and you had children doing things sort of in unison because the teacher said, now we'll all open up our laptops. Even though they could take them home and many good things happened, particularly when they were at home, I hadn't seen anything like this. And so while I don't advocate that everybody should learn without schools, it sure makes it pretty encouraging to think, first of all, when schools get to these villages, or school gets to this village, these kids are gonna make the best damn pupils you could ever have in the classroom. These kids really have learned. So what do you need? Now, so I believe that you need this, and I've only underlined, the word free is very important because it's free to the individual and it's low cost to society. But what I think you need is a totally counterintuitive. I have not even seen the words global public sector written, because the public sector is usually a national public sector. And the national is the unit that we make up the world out of. You go to something like the United Nations, and it's all built on the concept of nations. So for it to be global public sector, worldwide, and free are three very important, somewhat counterintuitive. So I'm going to just go through 2 or 3 slides and end very quickly. And so what are the 3 things that I can do, or what are some of the things? And one of them, I thought until yesterday I had a better handle on, but one of them is just simple advocacy. Like tonight, if I can just get more and more people to think that it should be free and it should be part of a global public sector, and that internet as a human right is a good idea. And out of the blue, this fell out of the sky, literally, the Pope became interested. I thought, wow. I'm not writing email to the Pope. And he asked through his Pontifical Academy that we convene some people at the Vatican in October, which we did, to write a statement about human rights and connectivity, which we did, that he signs, which he did, and we bring to the UN, which we did. And guess what? By complete coincidence, the Security Council, which has rotating members, had Italy on it that this past year. And then in the Security Council, they rotate the presidency, which by chance was the Italian ambassador. So I thought, wow, all of these things have just happened. And that's, like, you know, who knows how far it'll go and what'll happen. And it's nothing about Christianity or Catholicism, but it's just, again, not being a nation, or at least outside. Yes, the Vatican is technically a nation. Then the other thing is, could you make, and isn't it amazing it doesn't exist, could you make an organization whose responsibility was to connect people, just like the World Food Program feeds people, peacekeeping forces provide X and Y. Could you create, whether it's in the UN or something else? And the answer surely must be yes, you could do that. A lot of people don't want it, but it's certainly possible. And then the other thing you've got to do, which is really weird, is you've got to be outside the jurisdiction of countries for a number of reasons. And you can imagine most of them. But if you work within the jurisdiction of a country, you've got to follow a set of rules that are based on falling into the very competition that they have sold spectrum and done things, and they can't sort of devalue their own spectrum that they've just sold for a lot of money. So some of the ways you can do it is, well, low Earth, I happen to be a fan of this. It's not the only way, but you can do it. But something that, again, people don't think of about a low Earth orbiting satellite, it is by definition global. It goes, in other words, just because it's flying over Berkeley or some place where it could make some economic returns, it still does have to continue. And then if you look at the various orbits, at least it's going around a certain slice of the world. And so there's a geometry there that is different than any other one we've ever known. It's never really happened this way. We've never done something. Yes, you could launch a satellite, a stationary one that sees, you know, not quite half the world, but, you know, a big chunk of it. But we've never had one that has that property. So I'm almost at the end, or I am at the end. I'm sorry I've said that. And just to put numbers on it, it is a tractable problem. The industry of telecommunications over the next 5 years has committed to spending $450 billion to improve the infrastructure of the world, which is fine, but, you know, do that. But if it only costs you $10 billion to connect everybody, it's just not a big issue. By the way, the 10 billion is 5 weeks of the United States and Afghanistan. I mean, if you think of it in terms of treasuries, it's not a big amount of money. So it's totally possible, and I'll keep the risky part for questions then. Thank you.
Nick, that was as precisely as we imagined, brief, mind-expanding, provocative, and relevant. And I will move to take questions from the audience. Nick does have a plane to catch tonight, but we do have a good 15 or 20 minutes to talk here together. I will let you get your questions ready and let you get ready to wave for one of these microphones that help us record it for posterity. But I wanted to start by asking you to, in a way, go back to the beginning of the talk and your own background in architecture, a discipline dear to many of us in the room, and have you expand or contextualize the argument you presented simply in terms of the idea of public space, which is something that originally we thought of as a physical artifact that connected cities like Boston and New York and social space within it, and yet now in the internet we have, in the internet age, we have spatialized certain components of our telecommunications infrastructure all over the world. But I think one way to understand your argument tonight is that we're not thinking of that transnational space in the same way that we traditionally thought of it as a connective tissue and a public resource within the physical landscape of cities as well. So it seems to me, at least, that it's a very architectural argument. But maybe you could reflect on that while everybody else gets ready for their questions as well.
Well, one of the things I hear my architect friends talk a lot about is the public realm. And I don't hear that very often in other language. There's a lot more talk that I hear about the private realm. And so there may be a natural inclination to think this way, which is a combination of having come through an architecture program. But thinking about the public is very sort of, I don't know why more people don't. It doesn't seem to be quite as natural, perhaps. I've been working recently, much more recently, with things that approximate architecture that I haven't done before, to ask if one could completely renovate, and I really mean the word renovate, favelas and slums and parts without knocking them down. Could you build a city without infrastructure? It's pretty outrageous at the moment, but if you could do things that we've never ever done before. And one of the things about favelas is they don't have public realms, because by definition they're squatting, and anything that might be public has been taken by somebody else. And so you've got to sort of revisit that and look at it differently. And it's something I've been doing with Norman Foster over the past month. So it's sort of a little bit like going back home, but it's the public realm, and it would be, can you imagine if you could really renovate from within versus bulldozing?
Thank you, Nick. I mean, you are here at Berkeley. I mean, we are a public university, and we think a lot about that. I think that that actually could be something that's time to reconsider from different perspectives. But I'm actually curious about the link with Marvin Minsky. And one question I have to ask you is, you saw so far ahead in terms of the role of media 20 or 30 years ago. Where do you see the role of artificial intelligence today? The predictions, as you know, are extravagant, and I'm just curious where you see all of that fitting in.
You know, the predictions would be just as extravagant if you didn't call it AI. I mean, people, if you still called it big data or you called it something else. The part that I noticed, only because I knew Marvin as his friend, I would be always at dinner with all of his famous friends, you know, and we'd be cooking for Arthur Clarke, and we'd be doing stuff, and, you know, all of these, you know, people would just come through that kitchen in that house. And when we went out for lunch, or I was doing all the eating, okay? You don't talk in those situations, you just listen. And what did they talk about at dinner in the 60s? They talked about humor. They talked about, why do people appreciate music? Those were the questions that obsessed, if you will, the early AI people. They didn't talk about self-driving cars. They didn't talk about robotics. In fact, Marvin was heartbroken that AI took this robotics sort of drift, if you will. And so it was a different conversation. And the stuff you're hearing today isn't really about humor or about why people appreciate music. It's more in the self-driving car department. But again, it could be, you know, under any name at this moment. Okay. Is there more water anywhere? in any form. I mean, it could be in a bottle or.
Water's essential. I was a little uncomfortable at your picture with the African children and the tablets, because there was an assumption that tablets were just good for everybody, and the notion of a global public would include asking what is good for many different people, and I think that's a very hard question to answer from one point of view, which involves sending a bunch of tablets somewhere. And so there must be a lot of questions that still need to be asked there. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that arises. It's an important question, but are there some things that are globally good? Like let's call literacy one of them. Now you can argue, and I had people tell me with a straight face that it's don't, because if you educate kids in villages, they're going to leave the village. Well, the truth is, yes, they are going to leave the village. And kids do leave the village when they learn how to read. And do you then not teach them how to read? The answer is no. They've got to learn how to read, and then they'll go back to the village very often. And I know instances where they go back to the village to create schools, and then maybe the kids don't have to leave because there's schools, and they don't have to leave to get the schools, and it starts to build itself. But there are a few things, and those tablets, it's even worse. Those tablets were in English, which wasn't even their language, and the tablets were teaching them spoken and written English when neither the north or the south of Ethiopia use that as a language. In fact, the south doesn't even use the Latin alphabet. So, there were mistakes and things that you can look, but still the ability to do a lot of what's pedantically called autodidactic is kind of amazing, and it's a lot more than we think. Kids can do a great deal more than we think. Even those kids. Now, should they get something other than a tablet? I mean, I'm not going to dismiss the question, but I'm also not going to wait for the answer to try the experiment. So I think that's...
Yeah. I was curious about your idea of the global connectivity, and I was wondering whether you see it as sort of the next step in bypassing the current system of where nations control what version of the internet you get. It's like the internet in a place like Saudi Arabia is totally different than the internet here is totally different than the internet in China. And do you think centralizing that system is a step towards having a unified experience?
Well, it certainly is a step to having a unified experience, especially if you're outside of the jurisdiction and you're bringing, the raw backbone. But there's a body of argument I don't particularly agree with, that a crippled internet is better than no internet at all, because you probably don't have to have a crippled one. And it's an assumption, yes, in Saudi Arabia, it's got its problems that are different than the ones in China, and you go there and you can't even, I was in Spain a couple of weeks ago. In Spain, of all places, a developed country, rich, beautiful, maybe its government's a little sort of weak at the moment, but you can't get Google News. You say, what's up? What's wrong with Spain? And there's this silly thing, and Google pulled out, and there's an argument. So you can find but perfect countries you don't expect to find a different internet, suddenly there is. So if Google News is your screensaver, which it is mine, don't go to Spain, or at least don't expect it to work in Spain. And eventually, I think these things will pan out. Oh my goodness, somebody's got an OLPC. I haven't seen it. Great, that's great. What do you do for spare parts?
Sure. So there are many places in the world that aren't connected at all. I'm from Panama, and I've firsthand like experienced this. I've been to some communities, like very remote communities. You have to like go in car like 5 hours in, then you have to walk 8 hours, hike a lot to get there. And there's some places that like don't know internet, don't know light, all of this, as you mentioned on your speech. Yeah. And I was wondering, you're talking about a global public sector and many solutions for developing countries. I was wondering, like, how this solution you're talking about looks like. What would be the motivations for people to do them, and yeah, how they could be implemented. And for example, so many of these people that do not have access to information are like vulnerable to some solutions because of net neutrality. I was wondering, like, how do you look at that, and how we can bring information to these people without altering that infrastructure and letting them like still be the way they are, because there are like some, for example, indigenous communities that don't want to be like cities. They want to continue to be indigenous communities, but they still should have access to information.
Yeah, I'm not, there might have been 3 or 4 questions in there, but yeah.
I know it's a very complicated thing, I know.
But probably the most unifying, answer is that I've been in many of the situations where you have to walk the 8 hours, and you get there and just a little bit of setup, tiny, just a little bit of connectivity. You find, kids immediately are the agents of change. And in the laptop experiment, it turns out Peru was the biggest country. Peru did, it's quite incredible, Peru did $700 million of laptops. It was written into the Constitution of Peru, and it was voted by the Congress, and it was a big deal. And so Peru didn't do a great job in following up and compared to other countries. But the thing I saw in Peru that was the most heartwarming, that happened more in Peru, perhaps statistically because there were so many laptops, was kids teaching their parents how to read and write. And I said, oh my God, this is really interesting, because it's not that the kids are learning how to read and write, which is what I always dreamed about, but then they're teaching the parents how to read and write. And it's kind of a complete role reversal of what the relationship between kids and parents is, and yet the parents and the kids had, in some sense, a much stronger relationship because the parents suddenly viewed the kids very differently. And, again, it might be my optimistic, rosy eyes, but I just saw something that I thought was quite marvelous. So you just have to get this started. And kids all over the place are just so curious, and they really do become your agents of change. They just do. And there's almost no way to stop it. So you just have to, enable it and make it, make it be possible.
So we have time for 2 more questions. We have one back here who's been very patiently waiting, and then go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question about the hacking of the Android stuff.
Yes.
It's very interesting because I actually read the MIT review article.
Yeah.
It was very interesting because it talks about the kids hacking the Android and then enabled the camera that was previously disabled, and they circled around the security measures to customize the desktop so every kid have a different desktop. So I'm pretty sure some of you also have read the review. Mm-hmm. So my question is, what does this imply to the future of the program? So do you think this is a concern, or do you think this is an exciting opportunity?
Well, what you're bringing up, which is 100% true, is that we were really stupid to disable the camera. And then the kids found that out, and because of our stupidity, they didn't go in and just flip. They had to actually put some code in, and they, so to speak, corrected what I think in retrospect was an error, but I'm very glad we made it because it showed an ability. Will they be able to hack systems? Yes, of course. And in some sense, first of all, just as a sidebar, when I grew up, the hackers were the good guys. The word was used with great affection and great admiration. It was the people, the hackers were the people who picked locks but didn't steal anything. Okay, they were the people who could, and basically got so engaged. And the fact that the word drifted and is now the sort of bad guys is kind of funny, when you see it in the 50-year perspective. But the ability to change code is a very important one. And when the laptop started as a project, we, of course, used Linux. And you use Linux because it's open, and it is hackable, and it is changeable, and because the name Negroponte is a pretty unique character string, if I get Google, hits on Negroponte in the news, it's me or my brother. Okay, there aren't any others that make it into the news. And one day, I wake up to the news, Negroponte adopts Linux because it's hackable. I thought, wow, I know that. But it was my older brother who was director of national intelligence at the time, and the CIA, FBI, NSA had all adopted Unix because it was hackable. And so when you look at the defense agencies using it because it is, it sort of puts a different perspective on it, that you can change it. You don't have to call an 800 number to get Microsoft to do it, is actually an asset, not a liability. And the fact the kids could do it is, I think, pretty important.
Thank you. This was great. And you've mentioned some wonderful things that have surprised you. And I'm just wondering if there's any others just in this age that we're living in has really surprised you about the use of the internet or what we've done with it right now.
Okay, so we're taking current politics out of the surprising equation. Because that was quite something. I guess some of the things that I guess surprised me the most is, and it's starting to change, but it certainly surprised me for 40 years, was how computer programming itself fell off the table. I can't tell you how 40 years ago we truly believed that every kid at school, in primary school, would learn how to program. And it just didn't happen. It didn't happen for a huge... I think the reason it didn't happen wasn't so much malice, but was that it was hijacked from them by people who made apps for them to use. And it was hijacked so well that it was as if somebody had hijacked reading and writing and just only published books but didn't teach you how to write, or I guess you had to know how to read to appreciate the book. But the point being that it just disappeared, and it really astonished me. People who are 25 to 28 years old or 30 years old, who've gone through the best education systems you can imagine and have never touched computers the way we imagined everybody would. It was quite a shock, quite a thing. And now you get a little bit of reverse because, first of all, coding's the reverse of the word hacking. People who did coding were the losers, and people who did programming were the winners. In other words, programming was this art form, and then the coders were the people. It's like a typist. A typist is to text. Coding was to programming. And now it's drifted into the language that coding means programming. And then I think it's fine, but the idea that you're going to get a great job at Google by going to a summer camp in coding just seems to me so off the mark. But it's not bad. I mean, keep doing it, but it's sort of marketed a little bit. It's about thinking. If it were just called learn how to code to learn how to think versus learn how to code to get a better job, it would be, to me, a more honest advertising. But I was astonished that it didn't happen.
Well, we we have to get Professor Negroponte fed and watered, and so I thank your patience in understanding that we need to bring our evening to the close. I would just say I started the evening by reflecting on my own intense privilege in coming to the context of MIT as a middle schooler, and obviously it changed my life in all kinds of ways. I think the fundamental message of Nick's talk today is that we should extend to a far wider audience the intense and important privilege of connectivity and communication and literacy, not as a privilege, but as a right. And so I would like to applaud Nick and applaud that sentiment as a way to close the evening. Thank you so much.